We're going to take a look at lesson number 9 tonight of our Under the Sun lessons. And by the way, I think everybody in here has a folder. If you are joining us, maybe you're watching this on a delayed broadcast or something, and you're thinking, hey, I really want to be a part of this lesson. Be sure that you message me or email me or somehow get a hold of me, and I'll email you a copy of the lessons that we're looking at right now. And so anyway, Under the Sun, lesson number 9, which is Solomon's advice on government, is what we're going to be looking at tonight. And if I will do this and transition over here like this, now hopefully you're going to see this on your sheet. Okay, so Under the Sun, lesson number 9, Solomon's advice on life and government. And hopefully we're going to get through 2 pages tonight, half of it tonight. We're going to finish it up next week. But if you recall, what we've been looking at with the book of Ecclesiastes is a look at life under the sun, not a look at life that is from a spiritual perspective or from a point of view from heaven, but just simply life here and now. What is life here and now? And some of the things that Solomon comes up with are pretty depressing. It's life here now, and that is life that is not taking any spiritual thing into account, but just simply focused on ourselves here now. It is something that is very meaningless. That is what he's come up with. And so from that, he just kind of gives some advice of, how are we going to manage? How are we going to live life here under the sun? And in tonight's lesson, we're going to be talking about how we are going to kind of manage life in regards to government. And I know that, when we start talking about government, sometimes we start to stir up some pretty strong political opinions. And I'm certainly not wanting to stir up anything like that, but I want us to kind of focus on it from a wisdom standpoint, in understanding that there's a lot of times we just don't really understand everything that is going on with life, and we get very frustrated with it, and we get very angry. And when we do that, sometimes it's really easy for us to just kind of miss out on some of the joys and some of the pleasures of life. Okay? All right, so if we look at this, in fact, we're here in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 in verse number 2. I guess I should have turned to that earlier too. And before we get into look at that, if you take a look at your page here, you notice that it's important to remember 3 points about this as we look at the passage. Point number 1, and that is their form of government. When I say their form of government, we're talking about Solomon, we're talking about the Old Testament Israelites. Their form of government was a theocratic monocracy, not a democracy. Okay, so we live in a democratic republic. They did not. And so some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, really doesn't go hand in hand together, because, we're talking about their government versus our government. The two government structures were nowhere near one another. And you say, okay, well, if they were a theocratic monocracy, what in the world is that? Well, a monocracy is just simply a one-person rule, king rule, okay? Well, a theocratic monocracy is a little bit different, and that is that with a, hold on a second. I'm going to get rid of that line right there. Okay, so with a monocracy, you've got a king, right? Okay, and the king is going to be over his subject, mankind, okay? So that's a monocracy. Now, a theocratic monocracy is just simply this. We've got God, and God is supposed to be over the king, and the king is supposed to be over affairs of mankind, the affairs of his subject. Okay. Now, when you think about a theocratic monocracy, the only true theocratic monocracy that has ever existed has been the Old Testament nation of Israel. I know that today we've got different theocracies with like Iran or places like that where the religion is in control of the people, but that's not what we're talking about. Instead, what we're talking about is we're talking about how God is over the king and how the king is over man. And this was something that was really in place. Now, if you remember when the Israelites came out of Egypt and God established his covenant with them in the book of Exodus, he told them that he was going to be their God and they were going to be his people if they did what he said. And they agreed to it. And that was supposed to be all of that. God was supposed to be their king. They were supposed to follow God. And that's the way it was supposed to work out, but it didn't work out. When we look at the Old Testament and Old Testament history, we see that the Israelites constantly failed to worship God, failed to do what he said. And as a result, God would send different people in to punish the nation of Israel, different outside groups. Finally, the nation of Israel came to the point where they said, we need a king. We need to be like everybody else. And so God, please give us a king. And so God agreed to that request and gave them a king. First of all, starting out with Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. Okay, but here's the thing. The king could not and should not have done everything that he wanted to. Instead, what we see here is all of this was governed by the law, the Old Testament law. So if we come back, oops, I forget, I just can't do that. Okay, so when we swing back over here and we look at point number two, as a theocratic, oops, I keep on forgetting, I can't do that. All right, there we go. Okay, so as a theocratic monocracy, civil obedience was more than good citizenship. It was also moral righteousness, okay? And so if we go back and we look at this right here, since the law was what governed the nation of Israel with God, okay, then the law was also supposed to be governing the king. And so if people, mankind, let me get the right color here, if mankind was to have and follow the king, then civil obedience to the law was not just simply that, but it was also obedience to God. Their moral laws, their civil laws, their religious laws, they were all intertwined together, okay? And that really is an important distinction to make. All right, something else that we need to remember is this in number 3, and that is that the ideal was that everybody was supposed to meet, including the king, was God's law. However, because of sin, corruption and mistakes were the norm instead of the exception. And so when we look at the Old Testament history, we see that sometimes the nation of Israel followed God and did good, even though there were times like in David's reign, Solomon's reign, that there were problems that were there. But even aside from those things, a lot of times, majority of the times, following God to what this ideal is that we were talking about really was more of the exception rather than the norm. The norm, because of sin, because of corruption, because of mistakes, whatever you want to call it, that just didn't simply meet. Okay? And so because of that, in this idea about this is the way that things should be, it's kind of like this is the way that it should work in a perfect environment, but it doesn't, then how are we going to have some advice of what to get through things? Okay? All right. So let's take a look and kind of go back and take a look at Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Okay? Now, like I say, as we go through all of these sections, if you've got questions, be sure to put them in the comment box. And then as we're going through, I'm going to stop periodically and, look at the comment box and kind of answer some questions. And then we're going to go on to look at answer the questions in the bottom of the page. Okay? All right. So in chapter 8, verse number 2, it says this: obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Do not stand up for a bad cause. Do not stand up for a bad cause, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since a king's word is supreme, who can say to him, what are you doing? Okay, so one thing that we see about the first couple of verses here is that he's just kind of reminding some people of some very important facts, at least back in that day and time. In that day and time, the king really had the authority to do, I won't say whatever he wanted because God was supposed to be his ultimate authority. But he had a quite a bit of leeway to do whatever he wanted. And so if the king could, do whatever he wanted to do, if you were to come before the king with a request or come before the king with some advice, if the king didn't want your advice or if the king didn't like your request, what are you going to do about that? Okay, so because of that, he goes on to give a couple of bits of advice in the next couple of verses. He says in verse number 5, whoever obeys his command will come to no harm, and the wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a man's misery weighs heavily upon him. Since no man knows the future, who can tell him what is to come? Okay, so one thing that we see here as far as a bit of advice is that Solomon is saying that even though the king's going to do whatever he wants, that doesn't mean that your cause is lost. First of all, he says don't hurry out of the situation. Don't get mad about things. Don't storm off, in other words. But understand that you've got to have some wisdom about you. And even if your request or even if your advice is not listened to at first, if you have some wisdom about you, there may be a proper time and there may be a proper way and place for you to kind of work these things in. Nobody really knows the future. And so since nobody knows the future, including the king, including the person and everything like that, it could be that if it's the Lord's will, something might have opened up where they could have done that. And so because of that, he says in verse number 8 and 9, just kind of remind them about all these and what really is important. Verse number 8, he says this, no one has the power over the wind to contain it. No one has the power over the day of his death. As no one is discharged in the time of war, so wickedness will not release those that practice it. And so that last phrase there about wickedness will not release those that practice it. All of this idea about, trying to get the king to do what somebody wanted them to do. Solomon's just kind of reminding them that, you can't take a wicked route in order to get it. The ends don't justify the means, so to speak. And so if somebody is thinking, okay, well, the king's wanting to do this, and I don't think it's a good thing to do. And the only way that I know how to get my point across to the king is to do something that God is going to be displeased with. That's not the wise way to do it. That's not the right way to do it. Okay? All right. So before we go on into our questions, does anybody have any questions about that passage? I don't see anything in the comment box. Nobody's texted anything. Anybody got any questions that you want to mention at this point? I can't hear you, so I guess that's a no. I guess that's a no.
We have a delay too.
We got a delay too. That's true.
Like a 20-second delay.
I keep forgetting about the delay, so I'm going to have to sit here in silence for 20 seconds, watching my watch. Boy, is this as boring for you as it is me?
It's not boring for them yet.
It's not boring for them there. That's a good point.
In 20 seconds.
All right. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at some of these. Let's see. Where am I here?
Questions.
There I am. Let's take a look at some of these questions down here on the bottom of the page. Bottom of page number 27, okay? All right. So, question on page number 27 is read Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 21. So we're going to go over there to the book of Matthew. chapter 22 real quick. Of course, keeping our place in the book of Ecclesiastes, because we are going to go back over there later. All right, so Matthew chapter 22, and in verse number 15, it says this: When the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him with his words, they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Now, we need to understand that the Pharisees were people who were pretty much against the rule of Rome in Jesus' day. The Herodians were people who were for the rule of Rome in those days. So we've got some pretty mixed political company here. But anyway, as they're trying to trap Jesus, they said in the next verse, Teacher, they said, we know you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Paying taxes. Everybody's got an opinion about paying taxes, right? Okay, well, to these people, the Pharisees, they would have been opposed to paying taxes to Caesar. Instead, they should have said what their point of view was, hey, this money needs to go to God because he is our king. Whereas the Herodians, they were the people who were pro-Rome, so they were the ones that said, yes, we should pay our taxes to Caesar. So you see, they're trying to put Jesus in a predicament of picking one over the other. Okay? So how does Jesus answer it? Jesus answers them in verse number 18. At least I think that's a verse number 18. I don't have my glasses on. But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, Whose portrait is this and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, Give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Okay? And so Jesus is kind of saying, hey, you know what? There is a place to give to God. There's a place to give to Caesar. And give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. Okay, so here's the question. And I want your answers, your opinions in the answer blank, or text it to Shannon. And that is this: what is our obligation to God concerning our government? What is our obligation to God concerning our government? To the Jews, they kind of felt like, we shouldn't take the things of God and give them over to an ungodly government. And I think that sometimes today people have an opinion of, why are we taking our money and giving them to fund a very ungodly government? So, what do you say? What is your opinion? What is your obligation to God concerning government? What do you think?
Can I comment?
All right. Let's see what comment we've got. Carol says, obey the laws. Obey the laws. Good comment. Good comment. Anybody agree with Carol? If you disagree with Carol, you might want to text Shannon. You may not want to put it down in a public Facebook forum. Government might come get you. Conspiracy there. Obey the laws. Carol, I think you're 100% correct. We do need to obey the laws. In fact, when you take a look at Romans chapter 13, it says obey human government. Now, this isn't to say that, human government, you go back in history and from this idea about a theocratic monarchy is where, in England, they developed the divine right of kings. And that is, the king is here because God wants the king to be here. And if anybody opposes the king, they oppose God. And so therefore the government has the right to put somebody to death just simply because that's what God's will is. Well, that is very much a distortion of what the Old Testament standard was about God and the king and everything like that. But at the same time, we need to understand that whatever human government is there, that God has ordained human government to do that. God ordains human government to be in place in order to keep order, to keep chaos from happening, to keep anarchy from happening. There's a lot of times that we don't like government. We don't like what government does. And some people say, well, I'd be better off if we didn't have any government at all. But, do you really, really, truly believe that? Do you really think that with no government, no police, no laws, no punishment whatsoever, that we would really be better off? And so we do have a duty and an obligation to obey the civil laws of our government. Now, is there a time, and the next question, at what point should we disobey human government, if any? Okay, let's take a look at the book of Acts chapter 4.
Make sure you keep your right corner clear.
What's that?
Make sure you keep your top right corner a little down.
Oh, okay. Was that getting above things too much?
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't have to make it smaller. Just keep that right corner clear.
There, how's that? That looks pretty good. I think so anyway. Okay, Acts chapter 4, and verses 18 and 19. Now, if you're flipping over there while I'm flipping over there, let me give you the backstory to this, and that is Jesus was crucified, Jesus was resurrected, Jesus ascended up into heaven. The Jerusalem church was really getting going at this point. Peter preached on the day of Pentecost. 3,000 people were baptized and added to the church. And by the way, where it says added to is implying that the church already was in existence. There's some people that believe that the church began on the day of Pentecost. I believe that the church began during Jesus' ministry and that the day of Pentecost, 3,000 people were added to it. But as all this was going on, Peter and John were on their way to the temple to pray, and they saw a beggar. They healed the beggar. Everybody was amazed at the fact that Peter and John healed this, and Peter and John said, it's not by our power we're doing this, it's by Jesus of Nazareth, to which they started to preach to them about Jesus. Now keep in mind, Jesus had just recently been crucified there in Jerusalem, and some of those people that Peter was preaching to were there and observed and were participants in the whole thing, where they said that Jesus' blood be upon us and be upon our children. And so, these were words that were very fresh in people's minds and in people's consciences. And so the chief priest that orchestrated all of those things went and got them and pulled them in front of the Sanhedrin and warned them that they should not preach in the name of Jesus anymore. And so in verse number 18 it says, then they called them in again and commanded them not to speak or teach in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John replied, judge for yourselves whether it is right in God's sight to obey you rather than God. For we cannot help but speak about what we have seen and heard. Okay? So going back to our question, and that is, at what point should we disobey human government? At what point is it okay in the eyes of God to disobey human government? Anybody have any answers to that? I see some agrees, but I think that was to Carol. 20-second delay. I'm waiting for that 20-second delay. I took a long time, in my defense, I took a long time getting over to the passage. I took a long time. And hopefully you guys are looking at these things ahead of time. And so, you got your answers all ready to fire up and go. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, do we have?
Gary.
All right. Okay. When it goes against the word. Okay? All right? Gary, when human government violates or prohibits the free exercise of God's commands. And Gary, I think that, oh, hi, Paula. Glad you're here too. I think that, you hit the nail right on the head there. And that is, we've got a choice to make of whether or not we're going to obey what somebody says or whether or not we're going to obey God. To Peter and John, that was the case. And that is that Jesus told them that they were to wait in Jerusalem until they were empowered from on high, and then they were going to be witnesses of him in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the othermost parts of the earth. And so they were doing what God had commanded them to do. Now, here you got human government saying, no, don't do that. And so when we've got a time where human government is saying, no, don't obey God, then that's where we as Christians have got to kind of draw the line and say, you know what? You be the judge of whether or not I'm going to obey God or obey you. But I'm going to obey God. I kind of look, with all of this virus stuff and, churches closing and things like that, I've heard about places around the country where some churches, I'm talking about big churches, are refusing to close. And governments are coming in and threatening to close them. Or in one case, a pastor in Florida, the government there asked him to not hold service anymore, have service online, something, and he refused to do it. And we're talking about, a congregation of about 400 people. And so they warned him, and then they arrested him after the service. And so as far as an American with, a right of freedom of religion, and to me, I think that is a civil right that is that we should all hold very dearly, and that we should be very cautious and very protective of, because I do believe that there are people out in the world that would love to take that freedom away from us. I look at that, and so I think, that's terrible that a government is threatening to shut a church down, or it's terrible that the government is threatening to arrest a pastor. But at the same time, it's kind of like, well, why is the government doing this? Is the government telling us, no, you can't worship God? Or the government telling us, no, you cannot do this for God and only you? Or is the government trying to keep everyone's best interest at heart? And I think that's kind of one thing that we got to look at today, is just realizing that even though it's not the ideal to meet, and do this on the internet, I'd much rather be there, in the building, having Bible study there. But at the same time, we got to realize, hey, you know what? This is something that is for the good of everybody. And I don't think that, if somebody comes up and says, hey, you know what? I'm going to violate the government's instruction because of to God. I don't know if that's necessarily something that's a good thing. But anyway, that's just simply my opinion on it. Okay. Anybody else got any comments or opinions about this before we move on? Waiting. Shannon is shaking her head like, you ridiculous little man. No, she didn't. No, there wasn't that. She was shaking her head like, you ridiculous man. So I think that was more like it. All right. You have any more comments there? No? All right. Okay. Let's move on to the next page then. Let's take a look at page number 28. Okay. So page number 28, we're just kind of continuing to talk about this idea about living with government. Okay. And when we start to look at the next section about how he's going to continue his discourse about living with human government, he's going to find some things that he finds to be, meaningless. There's his key word again. So if you take a look back at Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse number 9. Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and in verse number 9. He says this. He says, all this I saw as I applied my mind to everything done under the sun, There's a time when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. Then too I saw the wicked buried, those who used to come and go from the holy place and receive praise in the city where they did this. This too is meaningless. Now, if you go back to your sheet and you take a look with this right here, in the NIV it says, when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. Okay? And you notice that I've got a more literal translation, which is the man domineers over the man to his own hurt. Okay? And so we got to ask the question, who is hurt? Okay? Which man is it that is hurt? Is it a man that is domineering, or is it the other one, the one that is being domineered? In other words, who's being hurt? Is it the bully, or is it the bullier? Or the bully or the bullied? Okay. When you look at the NIV, it kind of looks at as that the man who is the bully is going to be the one that is hurt. But really, I think that when we look at the context, it's going to be that the person who is bullied is the one that is going to be hurt in this regard. And it kind of makes sense, when you got a bully and a bullier, or a bully and a bullied, that just really sounds very similar, doesn't it? A bully and the one who is bullied, okay? That's very similar too. But you think that the guy that's being bullied, he's the one that is being hurt by all of it, right? And that does make sense. And so you think, okay, well, what's the meaninglessness that Solomon is talking about? And this is something that kind of goes down here to the next verse. And when you look at the next verse, in verse number 10, about then too I saw the wicked buried, those who used to come and go from the holy place and receive praise in the city where they did this. This too is meaningless. And so, when you go back to the idea about God being over the king, or God being over the government, the government being over people, that the bully is the one that is there in the government, and the bullied is the one that's the people, and that shouldn't be. God in His divine law, His Old Testament law, was one where the weak would have been held up. That the widows, the orphans, those kind of people. But in all actuality, it was the other way around, and the Old Testament Israelites were really judged harshly for that. And so here you've got people who would have been in high places who should have been upholding those rights, but instead what they were doing is that they were lording it over other people. They were domineering over other people, which was wrong in and of itself. But when they used to come and go in and out of the holy place and they were buried in the memory of them, people would have said, man, what a great person, what a fantastic person. And they used to give them praise. And Solomon's saying, you know what, there's just meaninglessness in that. It's just, it doesn't make any sense that they're not doing what God wanted them to do, but yet they're still being praised by others as being these great people. And so, that's the meaningless, contradictory side of life. And then if you look again in verses 11 through 13, you see a little bit more about continuation when he talks about crime and punishment. In verse number 11, he says this. He says, when the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, the hearts of men are filled with schemes to do wrong. And so if we go back to our sheet here, let's see. If you go on down here, we've got a couple of different things. We've got point number 1, and that is, in order for punishment to be determined, the sentence must be quickly carried out, okay? And, I think that's true in our lifetime. It was certainly true in Solomon's lifetime. And I think that's kind of one thing where we have gone wrong in our lifetime. It seems like, we have a sentence, for example, a death sentence, but the people who are being put to death the crimes that they committed are so long ago, people have forgotten about them. And, we read about somebody, oh, well, 20 years ago they did this, and it's almost like reading a history book instead of having the event fresh on people's minds. And then point number 2, as we look at here, and that is that although it seems as if a criminal gets a break when he does not quickly get punished for his actions, it's still better to be God-fearing. So if we look at the next verse number 12, it says, although a wicked man commits 100 crimes and still lives a long time, I know that it will be better with God-fearing men who are reverent before God. And so, there's times in this theocratic model that, somebody's going to get away with it, right? And their crimes are not going to be punished. But Solomon's saying, I still know that it's better before God that, if somebody's God-fearing and they don't do this. And then point number 3 is this, and that is, even if a criminal can avoid human authorities, he cannot escape God's judgment. And so if we look at verse number 13, it says this, yet because the wicked do not fear God, it will not go well with them, and their days will not lengthen as a shadow. And so if we go back and we think about, what we looked at earlier with this idea about this theocracy, okay? And that is that we've got man here, and he's a criminal. He's done something bad. He's, okay, bad man. Does that look like an angry face? Well, okay, you'll just have to use your imagination. So, if the king fails to do something against him, then God is going to do something against him. Now, when we look at this and we say, well, there's still times, though, that, somebody has committed crimes and it just seems like they get away with it. They don't get punished by men. And it just seems like God just continues to let them go and continues to let them go. But one thing I want to remind you about, and that is that, ultimately God is going to be the judge. And he is always going to have his final word, his final say. And so even if somebody gets away with something in this lifetime, they're not going to get away with it in the future. I mean, I believe that everybody's going to face judgment. If you're a child of God, we are told in the New Testament that we are going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, not as a judgment between heaven and hell, but a judgment on whether or not we have lived our lives good before God and lived a beautiful life before God, or if our lives were worthless. And it's a judgment as far as a judgment of rewards go. Now, if you're not a child of God, then that judgment is a judgment not of whether or not you go to heaven or hell, because if you're not a child of God, you don't have forgiveness, and you are going to be going to hell. But I believe that even in there, hell's going to be harder for some people than it is others. And people are going to still have a judgment for what they do here in this life. Okay? All right. So from all those things, we see that if we look at verse 14 and 15, he kind of gets down to the point. You see it says in verse 14, there is something else meaningless that occurs on earth. Righteous men who get what the wicked deserve, and wicked men who get what the righteous deserve, just like what I said earlier. This, too, I say, is meaningless. He's not thinking about life and judgment after life. He's just simply thinking about life here and now. But he goes on to talk about this. He says, so I commend the enjoyment of life, because nothing is better for a man under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany him in his work all the days of life that God has given him under the sun. And so of all of this oppression of government, oppression of authority, all of this other things, if we could just simply kind of look at life and enjoy life for what it is, then, we're better off. We just don't need to worry about all the wrongs and, all the injustices. We just simply sometimes need to say, okay, I'm going to do what I can do, and then just simply, let it go. Okay? Do the things that we can control the things we can control, and don't worry about the rest. All right. So do we have any questions about that? Anybody got anything that you want to put down in the comment blank? I'm not reading anything down there. Shannon, anybody texting you anything?
You just asked.
I just asked.
I haven't heard it yet.
All right. Giving a few more seconds for something to come in here. All right. Going on to take a look at these questions then, okay? All right, so taking a look at these questions. Let's see. There we go. Question number 1. Are there times where you have seen people praise those in authority even when they have been mean to them? What do you think about that?
Can you repeat that?
Question is again, are there times where you have seen people praise those in authority even though the people in authority have been mean to them? Now, keep in mind, that question was written a long time before President Trump was even in politics. And so that question was not directed to, President Trump or anybody in particular. But it's kind of obvious. I mean, to me anyway, I just kind of marvel at, when Trump was running for president and all the things that he said against Republicans, other Republicans, and some of the things that he said and some of the things that those Republicans said back to him. And then, now that he's president, it's kind of like, oh yeah, Trump is a great guy. And I'm thinking, you know what? I bet if I bet if as soon as Trump gets out of office, whenever that's going to be, but so whenever Trump leaves office, I'm sure that they're going to have a different story. Okay, I don't think that they've been buddy. But have you noticed that just anytime somebody's in authority, maybe it's not even governmental authority, but any sort of authority figure, maybe it's a boss. Maybe it's a teacher, whatever. Let's see, we got a comment here. All right. Yes, to avoid retribution or trying to get ahead at work. Exactly. And so, when we talk about kind of going back to that very first part of the chapter, Carol, of, having a little bit of wisdom about you of, when you approach authority. And they have the authority, they've got the upper hand. If what you want doesn't quite go through, it's wisdom to kind of take a step back and try to readjust and take it in a different light and different manner. Okay, and in that, and I'm talking about just simply wisdom under the sun. In that, sometimes you got to curtail your own opinions about somebody. And not voice them in order to get done what you even think is a good thing to get done too. Okay. Anybody else have anything on that? Waiting. Here's that 20-second delay. Shannon, if you see something pop up, then let me know. Okay, so moving on to the next question. And that is taking a look at Titus chapter 3 and verse number 1. Okay? Titus chapter 3 and verse number 1. I'm going to go ahead and kind of read this question here so that we can kind of take care of some of this delay. But in Titus chapter 3 and verse number 1, why should Christians submit to authority? Is it because it is the right thing to do, or because we are afraid of the consequences of not submitting, that is, submitting to authority? Okay. All right. So looking at this in Titus chapter 3 and verse number 1, It says, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient and be ready to do whatever is good. Okay? Pure, plain, and simple. We need to remember to be subject to rulers and authorities. When we like what they're doing, when we don't like what they're doing, when they pass laws that we agree with, when they pass laws that we don't agree with, we still need to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient. Okay? So the question is, number one, why should Christians do this? Okay? What do you think? Why should Christians do this?
Gary answered it.
Okay, Gary, we obey human law because it is God's will. Absolutely. You know, if you want to obey God, if you want to do what God wants you to do, if you want to do God's will, then you look and you obey His word. It's as easy as that. You know, a lot of people say, I want to do God's will. I want to do God's will. I want to do God's will. Okay, well, the Bible is God's will. So if you do the Bible, then you do God's will. All right? It's not any more complicated than that. And it says here in verse number 1, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities. So if we want to be in God's will, if we want to do what God wants us to do, then we need to obey human authority. And you say, but what if? Well, okay, if human government tells us to do something that is different than God telling us to do something, that's a different story. But other than that, that's the way it is. Okay? So now to the second part of that question. And that is it because it is the right thing to do or because we're afraid of the consequences of not submitting? Why should we submit to authority? Is it because it's the right thing, or just simply because we're going to get in trouble if we don't? Anybody got any comments on that?
Maybe both.
Shannon says maybe both, if you didn't hear her there.
I
And there is a little bit.
Both.
Jake says both, and there is that. In fact, there is a little bit idea in the book of Romans chapter 13 that if we do what is right, we have no reason to fear. And so if we don't do what's right, then we do have a reason to fear. And so there is that idea about fear being there.
I was thinking more along the lines, we're supposed to live peaceable lives, and retaliation is not creating peace. So doing something that creates retaliation does not bring a peaceable life. That's
right. And it's something that doesn't bring honor and glory to God either. And so people can kind of think that, I'm really doing good here by living a rebellious life. And by the way, Jake, I'm glad that you're still awake over there. I'm glad your rebellious nature hasn't taken over and that you're asleep.
I'm submitting to my authority.
You're submitting to his authority. Okay, very good. I'm just trying to figure out what authority is that. There may be the idea about, hey, we need to do this because we don't want to get in trouble. But we can even look beyond that and just simply say, we're not going to do this, not for the danger of being punished by it, but we're going to do this because it's the right thing to do. And, maybe there's been times, in your Christian life, it's like, there's a question if somebody says, well, should we do this or should we do? And that over there is something that isn't quite right. Sometimes we just seem to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to do this because, and somebody says, well, we're not going to get caught. Okay, but beyond that, for conscience sake, I'm still not going to do it because, it's what's right. All right?
Marianne and Carol agree.
Marianne says it is the right thing to do and it's God's rule. Exactly. And Carol says the right thing to do. All right. Looking down at the last question here, and that is, have there been times when you have done everything right only to be treated wrongly? What did you do? And so maybe there's a time at work. Maybe there's a time, of life, of, government, whatever form of government was. Probably not at the federal level, but maybe more at a municipal level. But maybe there's been times that it's been one of those things, right? Where you try to do everything right, you try to be a good citizen, you try to be a good employee, you try to be whatever, and it just seemed like you get dumped on, right? What did you do about it? Anybody have any stories that you're wanting to share there? Boy, that may be a book more than anything,
I carried on.
Kenzie said she carried on.
It
I would say carry on, my wayward son, but it's not my son over there. Okay. Now, what'd you say, Kenzie?
I said it didn't feel good, but I did it.
And it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good. And I think that in this life under the sun, we're gonna be there regardless. At one point or another, we're gonna face things like that. But what are we gonna do about it?
Find a new job.
Find a new job. Absolutely. There's been
I've
times
had
in
it.
Shannon, yeah, of not being treated fairly, not being satisfied with things, and there's sometimes that you can do things that can fix the situation, and sometimes you just need to fix it by just simply putting yourself in a completely different situation. Absolutely. Now, moving on with that, it says, if you would have followed Solomon's advice in verse 15, would you have had more or less joy? Okay, so Solomon's advice in verse number 15, going back to it, is this, and that is, so I commend the enjoyment of life, because nothing is better for a man under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany him in his work all the days of his life God has given him under the sun. Okay? And so, going back to this question, if you would have followed that advice, then in those kind of situations, would you have had more or less joy? In other words, just simply kind of, I think Twix is answering back there. I don't know if you can hear that or not, but I think she's trying to answer some questions too. In situations where we're just kind of in a rock in a hard place, and that we don't really seem to have the ability to change things. Sometimes we just need to try to do the best we can and just try to, enjoy things the best that we can too. And sometimes if we just stop looking at the problems of things, and we just start trying to enjoy things the best that we can, and enjoy the blessings that God gives us, then joy is going to follow along that. Joy is going to accompany it. And as I was looking over this earlier today, I think that a lot of times today in our society, we're kind of developing trends in our society to where we're almost trying to be knights in shining armor, finding causes to defend, And what I mean by that, it seems like a lot of times people today are just like, they want to get behind some kind of cause. And so it's like, what cause can I get behind? How can I affect the world? How can I right this wrong? How can I do this? And it's like you're just like Don Quixote, just going out trying to find something, some kind of enemy to battle, some kind of war to wage, some kind of dragon to slay.
They create a problem.
And they're creating problems in order so they can fix their problems. But I ask you, people that are like that, are they really fulfilled? Are they really happy? Do they really have joy? And I think not. I think that the problems and everything that they kind of create in their lives just, overwhelm them. And, they're always kind of have a bitterness to them, Now, of course, if we have it within our power to right or wrong, or to defend some sort of cause, yeah, absolutely we should do that. But at the same time, we're never going to right everything. We're never going to cure everything. We're not going to be able to fix the world's problems, because the world's problems go back to the sinfulness and the corrupt nature of humanity. And it's not government's fault. It's not industry's fault. It's not the economy's fault. It's our fault. It's internal, and we're never going to get there unless we fix this down in here first. And we're not going to fix this in here first unless we first have a relationship with Jesus Christ by faith. And then from there, we're not going to fix it unless we're walking by faith and walking by truth. But unfortunately, the world as a whole is not going to get there until Jesus comes back. And so we're always going to have these problems. We're always going to have these oppressions in government and life, everything like that. And so some of the wisdom that Solomon gives here really is sound wisdom, as far as when we hit these pockets as we're going through this life under the sun, and we hit those hard places. What are we going to do about them? Are we going to just give up? Are we going to have wisdom about us? Are we going to become cold, hard, and bitter, especially towards God? Are we going to realize, hey, wait a minute, there's something else bigger that's going on, and that God's going to have the final say in it, and things like that. So anybody have any last minute comments or questions before we continue on? Oh, we got Carla King. Oh, well, hi, Carla. Glad to have you with us tonight. We can consider how Jeremiah dealt with Jerusalem burning right before his eyes and concentrate right about God's faithfulness and never-ending mercy. And I think that's a pretty good comment, that when we look at things that are troubling, and of course, Jerusalem burning was because of God's judgment on Jerusalem. But at the same time, we can always look at God's faithfulness and God's mercy, even in those time periods. Okay? All right, anybody else have anything else? Yes, Kenzie?
There is no law against the fruit of the Spirit.
That's right. Mackenzie's mentioning the fruit of the Spirit. And after talking about the fruit of the Spirit, that last little phrase says, against such there is no law. Absolutely. All right. Okay. Well, I appreciate you being with us this evening, and I hope that you've enjoyed spending time in God's Word. I enjoyed bringing it to you. Next week, we're going to finish up with lesson number 9. And so take a look at, let me see what pages it is. It's page 29, page number 30, and then we're going to move on to the next lesson. And if you don't have a lesson booklet, if you want to message me, email me, I'll email you a copy of it, and you can follow along with us. Anyway, hope you all stay safe, stay well, and let's praise God all the days that He gives us every time we have a chance. Okay? All right. Well, thank you very much, and God bless.